They say a mother's love knows no limits, but what happens when that love is betrayed by the very child she gave everything to? Tonight, you'll hear the story of a woman who was humiliated, stripped of her dignity, and left broken in front of strangers by her own son. A son who once clung to her hand, now looked her in the eyes and said, "Get outside. This table is for the family." The restaurant fell silent that night, but that silence was not the end. It was the beginning of a fire that would burn through lies, greed, and betrayal. This is not just a story of revenge, it's a story of resurrection. A story of a mother who lost everything, only to rise stronger, sharper, and more powerful than ever before. She was betrayed in public, abandoned in private, and robbed of everything she had built with her bare hands. But what her son didn't know was that a mother's silence is never weakness. It's the sound of the storm gathering. So stay until the very end, because this isn't just about revenge. It's about justice. It's about how one woman turned humiliation into power, pain into strength, and a broken heart into a weapon. When she struck back, she didn't scream, she didn't cry. She smiled. Because by the time he realized what she had done, it was already too late. This is the story of a mother's vengeance, cold, calculated, and unforgettable. And trust me, you won't see the ending coming. The clinking of silverware and soft jazz in the background couldn't hide the sting of betrayal that burned through Margaret's chest that night. She had come to the restaurant with a simple joy, a mother's pride. Her son, Ethan, had invited her to dinner to celebrate the family. For weeks she had been thrilled, thinking maybe this was his way of reconnecting after months of distance. She had dressed carefully in her best blue dress, the one Ethan once said made her look young and radiant. But as soon as she walked in, she could feel something was off. The glances from his wife, the stiffness in his tone, the way the laughter stopped when she approached the table. When she tried to sit, Ethan's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Mom," he snapped, eyes cold, voice sharp enough to slice her heart in two. "This table is for the family. Get outside." For a moment, the restaurant went silent. The waiter froze. A couple at the next table glanced up in discomfort, and Margaret's hands trembled as she looked from her son's face to the one across from him. His wife, smirking faintly over her wine glass. Margaret's lips parted, but no words came out. Her throat felt tight, her breath shallow. She blinked, thinking she'd misheard him, that maybe he was joking, but his eyes held no warmth, no trace of the boy she raised. This was a stranger wearing her son's face. The air grew heavy, thick with humiliation as people around began to whisper. She could feel their pity, an old woman, rejected by her own flesh and blood in public. The humiliation burned deep, searing through her chest until it reached her soul. Her mind raced. What had she done? She had sacrificed everything for him, sold jewelry to pay his college bills, taken extra shifts after his father died, skipped meals so he wouldn't go without. And now, her reward was this. A command to get outside, as though she were some beggar intruding on a royal feast. Her hands tightened around the purse on her lap, the only thing keeping her upright. She forced a smile, fragile and trembling, and whispered, "I thought this was for the family, Ethan. I am your family." But he didn't look at her. He turned to his wife instead, asking her to order another bottle of wine, his jaw set in irritation, as if Margaret's presence had embarrassed him. The waiter, unsure of what to do, tried to pull out a chair for her, but Ethan shook his head. "No," he said coldly. "She's leaving." And just like that, the woman who had given him life, who had carried him through sickness, heartbreak, and loss, stood there alone while he dismissed her as though she were nothing. Her legs felt weak as she turned and walked toward the door. Each step echoed like a drumbeat of shame, louder than the whispers, louder than the music, louder than her own heartbeat. She reached the exit and pushed open the glass door, the cool night air slapping her cheeks. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Not yet. She stood outside under the yellow glow of the streetlight, clutching her purse, her mind replaying his words again and again, "Get outside." That moment broke something inside her, not just her heart, but the illusion that love was unconditional. She had believed a mother's sacrifices were sacred, that gratitude was eternal. But tonight, in one public, cutting moment, her son had stripped her of dignity and love in front of strangers. The shame turned to something darker, heavier, something that whispered from deep inside her chest. She stood there, trembling but silent, the restaurant window glowing behind her. Inside, Ethan laughed again, his hand brushing his wife's as they toasted their wine. Margaret watched them for a long moment. Her face was pale but calm. The fire in her eyes began to change, not the warmth of love anymore, but the cold spark of resolve. That night, humiliation planted a seed inside her, a seed that would grow, slowly, painfully, into something far more powerful. For the first time in her life, Margaret didn't feel like a mother. She felt like a woman who had been wronged, and one day soon, she would make sure her son understood what it meant to cast his mother out. After that cruel night at the restaurant, Margaret withdrew into herself, trying to make sense of what had happened. The wound was raw, but beneath it was confusion. How had her son turned so heartless? In the weeks that followed, she began to see what she had refused to see before. Her son's words at the restaurant had not been a burst of anger, but a mask ripped off too early. The pieces fell together like shards of glass cutting through her denial. His wife, Nicole, had always been overly sweet, insisting Margaret sign little papers to simplify finances. After her husband's death, they had promised to handle things so she could enjoy retirement. At the time, Margaret had believed them. She trusted Ethan, her only child, her blood. Now she began to realize that what she had seen as care had been calculation. Days later, she went to the bank and discovered that her joint account, where she'd kept her savings from decades of hard work, was nearly empty. The numbers on the screen made her vision blur. She had saved that money for years, for her old age, for emergencies, for Ethan's future children. But now it was gone. Transferred. You trade. She drove home trembling, fury and fear swirling inside her like a storm she could barely control. When she called Ethan, he didn't answer. When she reached him later that night, his voice was flat, dismissive. "Mom, Nicole and I needed to make some financial moves. You'll thank me later." He said it like he was doing her a favor. Margaret sat in silence, gripping the phone until her knuckles whitened. Financial moves. He had drained her account, transferred her house title to his name, calling it state planning. Every document bore her shaky signature from those days when she had trusted him blindly. Her own son had stripped her of everything she owned, with a smile and a pen. The depth of the betrayal made her dizzy. She had carried him in her arms as a baby, taught him right from wrong, and now he treated her as an obstacle, an old woman standing in the way of his greed. Days turned to weeks, and the manipulation deepened. Nicole called occasionally, her voice syrupy sweet, pretending concern while suggesting Margaret move into a smaller place, or even a home where she could get more care. It was all said gently, coded in politeness, but every word was a blade, slicing away Margaret's sense of belonging. She realized then that they didn't just want her money. They wanted her gone. Out of the house, out of sight, out of the picture. Ethan visited once, tossing her mail on the table, speaking to her as if she were a burden, not a mother. "You should have thought about these things sooner," he said coldly. "You're lucky I'm taking care of the paperwork." He wasn't her son anymore. He was a stranger in her living room, standing on the bones of her trust. His eyes had the hollow gleam of someone who valued wealth over blood. Margaret stared at him, heart pounding, realizing the horrifying truth: she had raised her own betrayer. That night, as she sat in her empty home, the silence pressed against her chest. The walls that once echoed with love now whispered deceit. But amidst the despair, something shifted inside her. She wasn't a fool. She wasn't helpless. Ethan thought he had taken everything, but he had underestimated one thing: her strength. She had survived poverty, widowhood, and loneliness. Now she would survive this too. And she would not just survive, she would fight back. In the quiet of her small living room, Margaret whispered to herself, "You've taken my home, my savings, my pride. But you've forgotten who built all this. And you'll regret that." The words were soft, but they carried the weight of thunder. For the first time in months, her eyes didn't hold tears, they held fire. When the betrayal was complete, Ethan and Nicole stopped pretending. They moved into her home, claiming it as theirs, and she was forced to leave with just a few boxes of clothes and memories. Margaret rented a small apartment on the edge of town, dim, cold, and quiet. The first weeks were agony. Each morning she woke up disoriented, reaching for familiar walls that weren't there. The silence pressed down on her like a weight. She would sit by the window, staring at nothing, asking herself where she had gone wrong. The isolation was unbearable, a punishment she hadn't earned. Nights were the worst. The echoes of laughter from her old home haunted her. The thought of her son dining at the same table where she once fed him as a boy tearing her apart from the inside. At first, she broke down daily. The betrayal had hollowed her, leaving her a shell of the strong woman she had once been. She stopped answering calls, stopped going to church, stopped seeing the few friends who still cared. Shame gnawed at her. She couldn't bear to admit what Ethan had done. She told herself she was too old to start over, too tired to fight. But even as despair tried to swallow her whole, life around her continued. Children playing outside, people laughing in nearby apartments. And slowly, she began to remember what it felt like to live, not just exist. One morning, she looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. Her eyes were dull, her shoulders slumped. That sight, of a woman broken by her own child, sparked something deep inside her, something primal and fierce. She thought of all she had endured before losing her husband, raising Ethan alone, working long nights to keep a roof over their heads. She had survived worse than loneliness. She began to walk each morning, breathing in the air, reclaiming a piece of herself with every step. She started reading again, books about resilience, stories of women who refused to bow. And then came clarity. Isolation, once her prison, became her forge. Away from their manipulation and noise, her thoughts sharpened. She began piecing together her next move. Quietly, methodically, she gathered documents, reviewed old records, and spoke to a kind lawyer at a local community center. Each discovery, every lie, every forged signature, every hidden account, became fuel for her transformation. The grief was still there, but it no longer controlled her. It burned, yes, but it burned like fire meant to purify, not destroy. Weeks turned into months, and Margaret's spirit hardened like steel. Her pain was no longer weakness, it was power disguised as silence. She realized something Ethan never would: revenge doesn't always come with shouting or violence. It comes with patience, precision, and truth. As she stood one evening at her apartment window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and blood, she whispered, "You took everything from me, Ethan. But you've forgotten. I made you, and now I'll unmake you." The woman who once trembled at her son's cruelty now stood calm, deliberate, unstoppable. Isolation had stripped her bare, but in that bareness she had found clarity sharper than any weapon. Her tears had dried, her voice had returned, and her revenge, quiet, cold, and certain, had already begun to take shape. Margaret's strength had always been quiet, the kind that stitched broken days together without complaint. But now, that same quietness became her weapon. The months of isolation had stripped away every illusion, leaving her sharper, colder, and far more dangerous than her son could imagine. She no longer thought of Ethan with sorrow, she thought of him with clarity. The man who called her Mom was not the boy she raised. He was a parasite cloaked in charm, feeding off her sacrifices and disguising greed as duty. But fate has a way of circling back, and Margaret was done being blind. It started with a letter, a bank statement mistakenly mailed to her old address. Her house, the one Ethan now claimed as his. The new tenants had kindly forwarded it to her apartment. not knowing they were delivering the first piece of his downfall. When Margaret opened it, her eyes caught the name of a company she didn't recognize, with transfers that matched her missing savings. Something stirred inside her, a spark of the woman who used to manage every bill, every account, every detail of her family's life. She started digging. She visited the bank, pretending confusion, playing the part of the frail old woman no one took seriously. But behind that gentle smile, her mind raced like wildfire. She discovered Ethan had forged her signature to transfer property rights, created false authorization forms, and even claimed she was mentally unfit to handle her own finances. Each document was a dagger. Every lie was fuel. She collected them quietly, piece by piece, until she had enough to see the full picture. Her son and his wife had built their comfort on the ruins of her trust. But that wasn't all. As she traced the flow of money, she found another name repeatedly linked to Ethan's transactions. A woman who was not Nicole. At first, it made her sick, but then she smiled bitterly. Her son's rot went deeper than greed. It reached into betrayal and deceit, poisoning everything he touched. He wasn't just corrupt, he was careless. He believed she was broken, too weak to see through his lies. That was his mistake. Margaret started documenting everything. She made copies, took photos, spoke to people who had worked with Ethan. Slowly, the puzzle came together. He had been embezzling funds from his employer's investment firm, hiding assets under false accounts in her name. The fraud was so intricate that it could destroy his career, his reputation, and his marriage in one blow. The realization didn't bring her joy at first. It brought silence. The kind of silence before a storm. She sat by her window that night, holding the evidence, her hands steady, her breath even. For the first time in years, she didn't feel powerless. She felt alive. Every day that followed, she planned with precision. She didn't rush. She didn't scream. Revenge, she knew now, was not an explosion. It was a quiet fire that burned until everything rotten turned to ash. She reached out to a lawyer she trusted, a young woman from the community center who had once admired Margaret's resilience. Together, they built a case strong enough to shatter Ethan's illusions. Margaret said little during those meetings. She didn't need to. Her eyes said everything. The final blow came when she walked into Ethan's office, unannounced. He looked startled to see her, dressed not in shabby clothes, but in the same blue dress she wore the night he humiliated her. She laid a folder on his desk and met his eyes. "You've stolen from me, Ethan. And worse, you've shamed the woman who gave you everything. I came to tell you this before everyone else finds out." His face drained of color when he saw the documents. His confidence cracked like thin ice. He stammered, begged, tried to explain, but she didn't listen. She had spent too many years listening. Now she was done. As she walked out of his office, she felt something powerful inside her, freedom. Not from poverty or fear, but from him. The chains of love twisted by guilt had finally fallen away. Her son had built his life on deception, but she had rebuilt hers on truth. The quiet mother he cast aside had become his reckoning. And as she stepped into the sunlight that afternoon, Margaret realized she no longer needed his apology. The world would see him for what he truly was, and she, at last, would be seen for what she had always been: strong, relentless, and unbreakable. Revenge for Margaret was no longer about fury, it was about justice. The days of trembling and tears were gone. Now, every breath she took carried purpose. She had learned that revenge was not shouting in anger. It was smiling while you set the stage for your enemy's fall. Margaret moved quietly, methodically, her every action deliberate. She collected more proof. Bank transfers, fake signatures, illegal property transfers, and stored them neatly in folders labeled by date. She knew Ethan's world ran on appearances. Reputation was his currency. So that was where she would strike. Her lawyer advised patience, and patience had become Margaret's greatest weapon. She began writing letters. To Ethan's employers, to the authorities, and finally to a trusted journalist known for exposing financial scandals. Each message was calm, factual, and deadly. She wasn't reckless, she was surgical. By the time she was done, the truth was a time bomb ticking beneath her son's empire of lies. She didn't stop there. Margaret knew her son's ego better than anyone. He loved publicity, loved to flaunt his success and perfect family. So, she waited until the company's annual charity gala, a glittering event filled with reporters, clients, and investors. She still had an invitation after all. Ethan had once been proud to introduce her as his mother, the woman who taught him integrity. That irony would soon become his undoing. Margaret arrived elegantly dressed, her presence commanding but calm. Heads turned as she walked through the crowd, but she didn't flinch. She found Ethan on stage, giving his speech about honesty, trust, and family values. The lies tasted bitter in the air. When he stepped down smiling for the cameras, Margaret approached him. He froze. For a moment, the confident man vanished, replaced by the frightened boy who knew when his mother meant business. "You should have remembered who taught you those values," she said softly, slipping an envelope into his hand. "You'll need this." Inside were copies of every incriminating document, bank statements, forged forms, and proof of his affair. And outside, waiting for the moment to erupt, were the journalist's story and legal filings scheduled for release that very evening. By the time Ethan opened the envelope and realized what she had done, it was too late. Phones buzzed, whispers rippled through the crowd, and faces turned toward him, first curious, then disgusted. The screens around the gala began lighting up with news alerts. Financial executive under investigation for fraud and elder exploitation. His wife's face turned pale as the weight of the truth crashed over her. Margaret stood there, serene, watching her son's perfect life unravel before his eyes. She didn't yell, didn't gloat. She simply said, "You told me to get outside that night, Ethan." "I did. And from outside, I saw everything." Then she walked away, leaving him surrounded by the ruins of his deceit. Her revenge wasn't just poetic, it was absolute. She didn't destroy him with rage but with truth, precision, and a mother's unmatched willpower. When the investigation deepened, Ethan tried to reach her, but she never answered his calls. She had said everything that needed to be said. Her silence now was her final weapon, echoing louder than any accusation could. The same woman he had humiliated in a crowded restaurant had outsmarted him in front of the entire world. Her revenge was not just the destruction of his lies. It was the rebirth of her own dignity. The scandal hit like a hurricane. Within days, Ethan's empire collapsed. His firm suspended him, his colleagues turned their backs, and his wife left, taking what little dignity he had left. Newspapers ran headlines about his crimes: financial fraud, exploitation of his elderly mother, and falsified documents. The once celebrated businessman was now a public disgrace, a walking symbol of greed and corruption. Margaret watched from afar, not with cruelty, but with calm inevitability. She had not destroyed her son, he had destroyed himself. She had merely pulled back the curtain and let the truth stand bare. The same people who once admired him now whispered about the woman he betrayed. The mother who had the courage to bring down her own flesh and blood for justice. But Margaret didn't crave their pity or praise. She wanted peace, and she finally had it. When the legal dust settled, her lawyer confirmed what she had quietly hoped for. Her home and finances were restored. The law had recognized the fraud, returning what rightfully belonged to her. She walked through her house again, not as a mother begging for love, but as a woman who had reclaimed her life. The furniture was the same, but the air felt different. There was no longer fear or guilt, only stillness, strength, and pride. She stood before the mirror in her hallway, the same one where she had once straightened her dress before family dinners, and for the first time in years, she saw herself clearly. Not a victim, not a frail old woman, but a survivor, sharp, unyielding, and victorious. One afternoon, she visited the same restaurant where her humiliation had begun. She chose the same table. The waiter, recognizing her, hesitated before asking if she needed company. She smiled and said, "No, I think I'm fine on my own." And she was. The clinking of glasses, the chatter, the laughter. It no longer hurt. It was just life continuing around her, and she was part of it again. She ordered her favorite dish, raised her glass, and whispered, "To peace." The past no longer had claws that could reach her. She had faced her son's betrayal, her own heartbreak, and the cruelty of greed, and she had walked through all of it without losing her soul. Ethan, meanwhile, vanished into obscurity. His name was tainted, his reputation ruined. But Margaret never spoke ill of him. When neighbors asked, she would simply say, "He made his choices, and I made mine." Her voice carried no hatred, only wisdom carved from pain. She knew revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about restoration. She had restored her dignity, her independence, and her spirit. Her victory was quiet, but it was eternal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret closed the door of her home and smiled softly. She had started this journey broken and discarded, told to get outside, as though she didn't belong. But now, she stood at the center of her own story, strong and untouchable. The world had seen her humiliation, but it had also witnessed her rise. Her revenge had turned to triumph, her pain into power. And in that peace-filled silence, she knew the truth: no betrayal, no cruelty, no son's greed could ever break a mother who finally remembered her worth. In the end, Margaret's story wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming power, dignity, and identity. What began as a night of humiliation in a crowded restaurant became the turning point of her entire life. The son who once made her feel small, who robbed her of love and trust, learned that betrayal carries a price far greater than money. Ethan lost everything: his career, his reputation, and the illusion of control he thought he held. But Margaret, she gained something far more valuable than wealth. She found herself again. When she stood in front of the mirror in her restored home, she didn't see a victim. She saw a survivor, a woman who had been broken but refused to stay shattered. The world that once pitied her now respected her. The whispers that once carried shame now carried awe. She had taught her son his first lesson in life when he was a child. But this time, she taught him his last. Never underestimate the strength of the woman who gave you life. Her revenge wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, intelligent, and poetic. She destroyed him not with hatred, but with truth. The same truth he tried to bury became the weapon that undid him. And when justice was finally served, Margaret didn't gloat or celebrate. She simply walked away, calm, proud, and free. Because true victory doesn't come from watching others fall. It comes from rising above the pain they caused and standing taller than ever before. In the years that followed, she lived peacefully. She spent her mornings in the garden, her evenings reading by the window, and her nights sleeping without guilt or grief. She no longer feared being alone, because solitude had made her unbreakable. She didn't just get revenge, she rebuilt her soul. And that was the ultimate triumph. Her story reminds us all of one undeniable truth: no matter how deep the betrayal, no matter how cruel the fall, you can always rise. Pain doesn't have to destroy you, it can refine you. Sometimes the most powerful comeback isn't about vengeance, but about showing the world that you cannot be erased, controlled, or silenced. Margaret's journey is for every person who's been betrayed, underestimated, or cast aside. It's proof that silence can be strength, and kindness can turn into the sharpest form of justice when pushed too far. The same woman who was told to get outside ended up standing above everyone who once looked down on her. That's not just revenge, that's evolution. If Margaret's story moved you, inspired you, or made you believe in the power of resilience, then don't just stop here. There are more stories like this, stories of strength, justice, and transformation that will make you think, feel, and fight for yourself again. Subscribe now for more inspiring stories of courage, betrayal, and redemption, where pain becomes power and endings become new beginnings. Because like Margaret, you too have the strength to rise from the ashes and rewrite your story.